Colorado, 1885. A man can be haunted by things other than ghosts. He can be haunted by empty spaces, by the silence in a house built for voices, by the way sunlight falls across a floor where no small feet will ever run again. Elias Thorne was a man haunted by arithmetic. He knew, with the unforgiving precision of a ledger, that he was 48 years old. He knew his ranch spanned 1,200 acres of rock and grass. He knew it had been 10 years, 4 months, and 17 days since the house had been full. 10 years since the fever had taken his wife, Sarah, and their son, Thomas, in the space of a single, brutal week. He had done the math. He had 2 graves on the hill overlooking the creek, 1 wife, 1 son. He had 1 dog, a blue heeler named Blue, whose loyalty was a quiet, steady pressure against his leg in the evenings. And he had 1 life, a long, straight line of chores, stretching from a lonely dawn to a silent dusk. He had stopped expecting anything to change the numbers. His mornings were a ritual of solitude. He rose before the sun, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. He did not need an alarm. The habit was set deeper than bone. The coffee he brewed was strong and black, and he drank the first cup standing by the window, watching the eastern sky bleed from charcoal to violet to a pale, hopeful blue. The house behind him was a vast, hollow thing. The kitchen was too large for 1 man. The long dining table, built by his own hands for family meals and holiday gatherings, now held only a stack of old almanacs and a lantern waiting for a new wick. The upstairs rooms were closed off. He did not need to see the small bed in Thomas's room, the faded quilt in his own that still held the ghost of Sarah's scent, if he let himself imagine it. He did not let himself imagine it. Imagination was a currency he could no longer afford. Work was the only coin that had value. After coffee, he and Blue would begin the day's labor. They walked the fence lines, their boots and paws leaving twin tracks in the dew-wet grass. Elias's hands, calloused and competent, could fix anything that was broken. A loose post, a snapped wire, a sagging gate. He worked with a focused, methodical calm. His body knew the rhythms of the land, the language of wood and wire and weather. He read the sky like a sailor reads the sea. He understood the logic of his world. You put in the work, you reaped the reward. Hay in the barn, cattle fat for market, wood split for the winter. It was a simple, honest transaction. But the house remained empty. The work filled his days, but it could not fill the silence. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, with the wind howling a lonely song around the eaves, the silence was so loud it felt like a physical presence. It sat with him at the table. It lay beside him in the cold bed. It was the final, unchangeable sum of his life's subtractions. He was a good man. His neighbors in the small town of Redemption, a day's ride away, would say so. Quiet, but fair. Kept to himself, but you could count on his word. He was a man carved from the same hard, enduring material as the mountains that framed his valley, but they also saw the stillness in him, the way a man looks when he has decided to simply endure rather than to live. He had stopped fighting the emptiness. He had just made room for it. It was a Tuesday in early June when the arithmetic of his life was interrupted. He had ridden into Redemption for salt, flour, and a new blade for his scythe. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a general store, a smithy, a saloon, and a church whose steeple seemed to be perpetually leaning as if in prayer. He tied his horse, Buck, outside Abernathy's general store and nodded to the few familiar faces he passed. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose round face and wire-rimmed spectacles gave him the look of a kindly owl, was leaning over the counter, speaking in a low voice to a young woman. Elias didn't mean to stare, but he was a man who noticed things, and he noticed her. She was young, maybe half his age. She stood straight-spined, though her simple calico dress was travel-worn and faded. Her hands were clasped in front of her, still and steady. She had a face that wasn't pretty in the way of saloon girls or the banker's wife, but it was handsome. It had character. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, were fixed on Abernathy, and she listened with a grave intensity. She looked displaced, like a bird blown far off course, but she did not look defeated. He gathered his supplies, stacking them on the far end of the counter, trying not to listen. But Abernathy's voice carried. No work at the hotel, and the Reverend's wife just took on her cousin. I'm sorry, miss. I see, the young woman said. Her voice was as clear and low as her gaze. Thank you for your time. She gave a small, dignified nod and turned to leave. There was no plea in her eyes, no hint of desperation, only a quiet acceptance of the fact, and the readiness to move on to the next. That was when Abernathy saw him. Elias, hold a moment. Elias paused, his hand on a sack of flour. The young woman stopped near the door. This here is Miss Clara May Thompson, Abernathy said, gesturing between them. Her family was heading west, ran into some trouble. She's looking for work, anything. Housekeeping, mending, cooking. She's a hard worker, I can tell. Elias looked at her. Her gaze met his directly. It was unnerving. People usually looked away from his quiet intensity. She did not. I don't have much need for help, Elias said. It was the truth, but it was also a lie. The house was a shambles of neglect, a monument to a man who had forgotten how to care for anything other than his livestock and his land. I'm not looking for charity, she said, her voice even. Just an honest wage for honest work. The silence stretched. Elias thought of the dust on the sills, the pile of unmended shirts, the cold suppers of bread and jerky. He thought of the crushing weight of the silence. He looked at her hands. They were clean and capable looking, not soft. He looked at her eyes again. They held no pity, for him or for herself. They held only a calm, steady light. It was an impractical thought, bringing a stranger, a young woman, into his house, into his solitude. It would disrupt the careful, painful order of his days. But Abernathy was watching him, and the young woman was waiting, her stillness a question. I can pay $1 a week, he heard himself say, and board. The work is hard. I'm not afraid of hard work, Clara May Thompson said. I'll need to fetch my things, she added, gesturing to a small, worn satchel near the door. That's all? Elias asked, surprised. It's all I have, she replied without a trace of sorrow. It was just a fact, another number in the ledger. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Clara May rode on the wagon seat beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't chatter. She watched the landscape with an observant stillness that reminded him of himself. She saw the hawk circling high above, the way the creek cut through the long grass, the line of distant peaks against the sky. She was reading the land, just as he did. When they arrived, he gestured to the house. It's quiet, he said, the word inadequate. She looked at the sturdy log home, at the wide porch, at the 2 lonely chairs sitting empty. It's a good house, she said. It has strong bones. He showed her to a small room at the back, one that had been for storage. It was clean, but bare. This will do, he said. It will do fine, she answered. And that was that. The transaction was complete. He had hired a housekeeper. He told himself it was just a practical arrangement, a matter of arithmetic. $1 a week for a clean house and warm meals. It made sense on paper. He did not let himself think about what it might mean for the silence. The first few days, Elias watched her. He was a man who trusted actions, not words, and he observed her work with a critical, cautious eye. He expected disruption. He expected noise. He got neither. Clara May moved through his house with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible. She did not scrub away the character of the place, she polished it. The dust that had lain like a shroud on Sarah's rocking chair was gone, but the chair remained in its place by the hearth. The windows were washed, and the afternoon light now streamed into the kitchen, illuminating the grain of the wood on the floor she had swept and scrubbed. She found the pile of mending he had ignored for months and began to work her way through it, her stitches small and neat and strong. She did not speak much, but her presence was a constant, gentle hum against the backdrop of his silence. The first morning, he came into the kitchen to find 2 cups set out on the table and the coffee pot simmering on the stove. He stopped in the doorway, thrown by the simple gesture. 2 cups. It had been a decade since anyone had set out 2 cups in this house. He said nothing. He just poured a cup for her and one for himself and sat down. She joined him a moment later, and they drank their coffee in a shared, comfortable quiet. It became a ritual. 2 cups of coffee at dawn. A silent communion before the day's work began. He saw her competence everywhere. She found the neglected chicken coop, cleaned it, and coaxed the hens into laying again. Soon there were fresh eggs for breakfast. She discovered the overgrown patch by the kitchen door where Sarah had once grown herbs, and without asking, she tilled the small plot of earth and planted seeds she must have bought with her own scant savings. She handled his dog, Blue, with a calm authority, and the dog, who was wary of strangers, took to her immediately. In the evenings, Blue would leave his usual spot at Elias's feet and lie down by the kitchen door, waiting for her to be done, as if he had appointed himself her guardian. Elias found himself watching her hands, mending a shirt, kneading dough, weeding the new garden. They were never still, and they were endlessly capable. They were hands that knew how to create, to fix, to nurture. One evening, he came in from the fields, late and bone-tired, to find a plate of stew and a thick slice of bread waiting for him on the table, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. He ate alone, as always, but he was not lonely. The simple, thoughtful act was a conversation. It has said, "I knew you would be hungry. I thought of you." He started making small gestures in return. He made sure the wood box by the kitchen stove was always full. He spent an afternoon sharpening the kitchen knives he had let grow dull. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door. They were his own quiet sentences in this unspoken dialogue. "I see your work. I value it." A month passed. Then, too, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of dust and disuse. There was the soft sound of her humming as she worked. It was a change so gradual, he almost didn't notice it, like the turning of a season, until one day he realized the crushing weight of the silence had lifted. It was still quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, a shared quiet. His trips to town changed, too. Abernathy would peer at him over his spectacles with a knowing twinkle in his eye. "Things seem to be agreeing with you, Elias. You've lost that pinched look you've been carrying for years." Elias would just nod and pay for his goods. But one afternoon, another man took notice. Silas Croft, the town banker, was a man who dealt in the arithmetic of money and influence. He was handsome, prosperous, and wore his confidence like a well-tailored suit. He saw Clara May waiting for Elias by the wagon and approached her, tipping his hat. "Miss Thompson," Croft said, his voice smooth as polished wood, "redemption is certainly brighter for your presence. A man would have to be blind not to notice." From the store's doorway, Elias watched. He saw Clara May give a polite, brief nod. "Mr. Croft, I trust you're finding your employment suitable?" Croft asked, his gaze lingering on her. "A remote ranch seems a lonely place for a woman of your qualities." "I find my situation more than suitable," Clara May said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My employer is a good man." Elias felt a strange, unfamiliar jolt in his chest. It was a hot, protective feeling he hadn't felt in years. Croft was offering her the world of arithmetic, of money, of social standing, and she was defending him, a quiet, worn-out rancher. Croft, unused to being dismissed, however politely, gave a tight smile. Well, should you ever decide you're in the market for a less rustic life, you know where to find me. He tipped his hat again and walked away. Clara May's eyes met Elias's over the short distance. He saw no flattery in them, no indecision, only the same steady calm as always. But he had seen the exchange, and a new, unsettling calculation began to form in his mind. It means everything to know where this voice is reaching, to picture you in your homes, in your cars, on your daily walks. What country are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments below. It's a small thing, but it makes this wide world feel a little closer. Now, let's get back to the story, because a man who has lived by numbers for a decade is about to find out they don't add up the way he thought they did. The thought burrowed into him on the ride home. Silas Croft was right. She was young. She was capable. She was a woman who could and should have more than a life of quiet service on a lonely ranch with a man twice her age. A man who was a living memorial to a dead family. The silence in the wagon was different this time. It felt heavy with things unsaid, with the future that was hers to claim, and the past that was his to endure. That evening, they sat on the porch. It was a habit they had fallen into. After the supper dishes were cleared and the chores were done, they would sit in the two chairs and watch the day end. They rarely spoke, but he had come to cherish this time. It was a quiet affirmation that they had made it through another day together. But tonight, the quiet was strained. Elias stared out at the fields, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The arithmetic was spinning in his head. She was 24. He was 48. The difference was a chasm. He had a past filled with ghosts. She had a future waiting to be written. It was not a fair equation. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of responsibility, of decency. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't let her waste her youth on him, on his quiet, broken life. It wasn't right. He had to say something. He had to be the one to be sensible. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough in the twilight air. Clara May. She turned her head slightly, her profile outlined against the deepening purple of the sky. Elias, you've been here almost 4 months now, he began, his voice stiff. You're a fine woman, the finest. You're capable and kind, and you work harder than any 3 men I know. She waited, her stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil in his chest. He had to force the words out. They felt like stones in his mouth. You should marry a man of means, he said, the sentence flat and final. Someone like Croft. Someone who can give you a proper life. Children. A nice house in town. Pretty things. You deserve that. Not this. He gestured vaguely at the vast, lonely landscape, at the quiet house, at himself. He was trying to be noble. He was trying to set her free. He was trying to do the right thing, the sensible thing. She didn't answer immediately. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, where the last sliver of sun was sinking behind the mountains. The world seemed to hold its breath. Blue, lying at his feet, whined softly, as if sensing the fracture in the evening's peace. Then she spoke. Her voice was so quiet, he almost missed it. A whisper on the cooling air. I already found him. The words hung between them, shimmering and impossible. Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. He thought of Silas Croft, of his smooth words and expensive suit. He felt a sharp, bitter pang of loss. She had made her choice. Of course she had. It was the logical thing to do. Croft, he said, his voice hollow. He's a wealthy man. She finally turned to look at him fully, and in her eyes he saw no thought of the banker. He saw something else, something that made the air leave his lungs. There was a gentle patience in her gaze, a deep and unwavering certainty. "No, Elias," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not Mr. Croft." He was lost. The numbers, the logic, it was all failing him. "I don't understand," he said, and it was the truest thing he had said in a decade. "You told me I should marry a man of means," she said, her eyes holding his. "When I first came here, I had nothing, just a satchel of worn-out clothes and a heart full of holes. I was looking for a place to be safe, a place to be useful. I wasn't looking for anything else." She leaned forward slightly, her earnestness a palpable force. "A man of means. To me, it isn't about the money in his bank. It's not about a fancy house in town. I saw that life back home. My father had money, for a time. It didn't make him kind. It didn't make our home happy." Her gaze drifted for a moment to the sturdy posts of the porch, to the solid logs of the house. "Means, to me, is a man who knows how to mend a broken fence. It's a man whose hands are calloused from real work. It's a man who is quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because he knows what's worth saying." Her eyes came back to his, and they were shining now. "A man of means is a man who makes 2 cups of coffee instead of one without ever being asked. He's a man who keeps the woodbox full. He's a man who provides a roof that doesn't leak and a door that locks against the dark. He's a man who has known sorrow and hasn't let it make him cruel. He's a man who offers a place to a stranger and treats her with respect." She took a small, shaky breath. "You think your life is this?" she whispered, echoing his dismissive gesture. "This is a home. This is peace. This is value. You are a man of great means, Elias Thorne, the richest man I have ever known." He could not speak. He could not move. Every word she spoke dismantled the cold, hard arithmetic he had lived by. She wasn't counting dollars or years. She was counting character. She was counting kindness. She was counting cups of coffee. She had looked at his quiet, broken life, and she had not seen lack. She had seen wealth. The silence that fell was no longer empty. It was full. It was overflowing with the weight of her confession, with a hope so terrifying and so beautiful it made his heart ache. He had offered her a sensible, calculated escape, and she had countered with an impossible, heartfelt truth. She had seen him, the real him, buried under years of grief and solitude, and she had not turned away. He spent the next few days in a daze. Her words replayed in his mind, a constant, gentle refrain: "The richest man I have ever known." He went about his chores by rote, his body moving through the familiar rhythms, while his mind wrestled with a new, terrifying algebra. The old arithmetic was simple. He was 48. She was 24. He was a widower, a man whose heart was a closed-off room. She was a beginning. He was an end. The sum of it was impossibility. It was wrong. It was selfish of him to even consider it. He walked the fence lines at night under a canopy of cold, distant stars, arguing with the ghosts of his past. He told Sarah he was too old. He told Thomas he had no right to another happiness. He told himself that the best, most decent thing he could do was to give Clara May her wages, thank her for her service, and send her to town to find the life she truly deserved. A life with a man her own age, a man without a history etched in granite on the hillside. He would do it for her own good. It was the only practical solution. But then he would see her. He would see her in the morning light, her brow furrowed in concentration as she staked up the tomato plants in her little garden. He would see the way she smiled when Blue rested his head on her knee. He would come in from the fields and smell the scent of fresh baked bread, a smell he hadn't realized he'd missed like a limb, and his resolve would crumble. He picked up the shirt she had mended for him last week. The tear along the cuff had been jagged and ugly. Now it was a neat, almost invisible line of stitches. She hadn't just patched the hole, she had woven the fabric back together, making it strong again. She was mending his life in the same way, quietly, competently, and with a care that asked for nothing in return. He was counting the wrong things. He had been counting years. He had been counting losses. He had been counting ghosts. Clara May was counting differently. She was counting cups of coffee. She was counting mended shirts. She was counting quiet evenings on the porch. Her ledger was not one of profit and loss, but of effort and kindness, of value. The house was not just clean, it was warm. His life was not just orderly, it was beginning to feel full. He was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the familiar, safe, and crushing silence of his past. The other led toward her, toward a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. It was an uncertain path. It was an impractical path. It defied all the cold logic that had been his shield for a decade. He stood at the kitchen window, watching her hang laundry on the line. The white sheets billowed in the breeze, bright against the deep blue of the sky. She looked up and saw him watching. She didn't smile, not exactly. She just held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes was the same steady, patient light. She was waiting. She had stated her truth, and she was giving him the dignity of finding his own. He made his decision. He would not be practical. He would not be sensible. For the first time in 10 years, he would be brave. He pushed open the kitchen door and walked out into the sunshine. He found her by the creek the next afternoon, where she was gathering smooth, flat stones. For what purpose he did not know. The water murmured over the rocks, a peaceful, constant sound. She looked up as he approached, her hands full of stones. He did not have any fine words. He was not a man like Silas Croft. He only had the plain, unvarnished truth. He stopped a few feet from her, his hat in his hands. "Clara May," he said, his voice rough, "I've been doing my arithmetic all wrong." She watched him, her expression unreadable, and slowly set the stones down on the grass. "For 10 years," he continued, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, on the flowing water, "I've only been counting what I've lost. It seemed like the only sum that mattered. I am 48 years old. I have a past that is heavy. I don't have much to offer a woman, not the things a young woman should want." He finally met her eyes. "But you count differently. You see value where I only saw emptiness. I don't know if I have the right to ask. I don't know if it's fair, but I'm asking." He took a breath. "I'm asking if you would be willing to take on this worn-out ranch and the worn-out man who comes with it. I am asking you to marry me, Clara May." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the creek. He stood there, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than he had ever felt in his life. He had laid his own plain truth at her feet. A small, slow smile touched her lips, transforming her handsome face into something truly beautiful. She took a step closer to him. "Elias," she said, her voice soft and full of a gentle amusement, "I've been waiting for you to finish your sums." And then she was in his arms, her head resting against his chest. A perfect fit. He held her, breathing in the scent of sunshine and clean cotton, and felt a decade of solitude fall away from him like a heavy coat. The house had strong bones, she had said. He was beginning to think he did too. They were married 3 days later. They rode to town together in the wagon, not as employer and housekeeper, but as a man and a woman about to join their lives. The preacher, a kind man with weary eyes, met them at the church. Abernathy, who seemed to have a sixth sense for town events, appeared as their witness, beaming at them over his spectacles. "About time, Elias," Abernathy said, clapping him on the shoulder with more force than was strictly necessary. "A man's not meant to be an island." The ceremony was short and simple, just a few words, a prayer, and a promise. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Elias turned to Clara May. He didn't kiss her, not there in front of the others. He just took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, strong and sure. It felt more binding than any ring. The news traveled through redemption on the wind. Silas Croft, it was said, was seen leaving the saloon looking thunderous. But the rest of the town, the people who knew Elias Thorne, not as a set of assets, but as a good, grieving man, were pleased. They saw the rightness of it. It wasn't a story of arithmetic, it was a story of restoration. 2 years passed, the ranch thrived, the fences were all in good repair. The herd was larger, the barn was full, and the small herb garden by the kitchen had expanded into a riot of green that scented the entire yard. The house, too, was changed. The upstairs rooms were open now, aired out, and filled with light. And in the room that had once belonged to Thomas, there was a new, smaller crib. In it slept a baby girl named Sarah, a child with her mother's storm blue eyes, and Elias swore, her father's quiet, observant nature. The silence was gone. It had been replaced by the gurgle of a happy baby, the soft hum of a woman singing, the creak of a rocking chair by the fire. It had been replaced by life. One evening, in late summer, Elias and Clara May sat on the porch, just as they used to. The air was warm, smelling of cut hay and impending rain. Clara May held the sleeping baby in her arms, her cheek resting on the child's downy head. Elias watched them, a feeling of such profound contentment washing over him that it was almost painful. He reached out and took his wife's hand. She looked up at him, her eyes soft in the twilight. "A man of means," he said, his voice a low rumble. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Still think I qualify?" Clara May leaned her head against his shoulder, her free hand coming up to rest on his. "Elias Thorne," she whispered, her voice full of love and unwavering certainty, "you are the richest man I have ever known." He looked out at the land, his land, at the house, his home, and at the woman and child, his family. The old ghosts were quiet. The empty spaces were full. The arithmetic had finally been corrected. He had subtracted a wife and a son, a devastating loss. But life, in its own mysterious and merciful way, had allowed him to add a new wife and a daughter, and had multiplied his happiness beyond any measure he could have imagined. He had stopped counting and started living, and it was more than enough. And so we come to the end of our story. But the end of a tale is simply the beginning of its meaning. This was a story about a man named Elias who believed his life was a matter of simple, brutal arithmetic, a ledger of his losses. He had done the math and concluded he was bankrupt in all the ways that mattered. He was too old, his heart was too scarred, and his home was too empty. He lived by the cold, hard numbers of his past. Then a woman named Clara May arrived, and she came with a different kind of ledger. She didn't count the years that separated them. She didn't count the dollars he didn't have, or the social standing he couldn't offer. She counted the calluses on his hands. She counted the quiet acts of decency. She counted the cups of coffee he poured, the wood he stacked, the unspoken respect he offered. She was not interested in the arithmetic of the world, but in the value of a man's character. Elias tried to push her away with his logic, telling her to seek a man of means, believing that meant money, believing he was trying to be noble, but what he was really doing was hiding behind his numbers because he was afraid to hope. But Clara May redefined the word for him. She showed him that true means are not held in a bank, but in a person's soul. It is the means to be kind when you are tired, the means to be steady when the world is not, the means to build a home not with timber and nails, but with safety and care. This story is a reminder that we are often our own worst accountants. We tally up our past failures, our age, our heartbreaks, and we convince ourselves that we are not worthy of a new future. We believe the sensible, practical numbers. But the heart keeps a different kind of books. It values courage over comfort. It values kindness over currency. It teaches us that a home is not a structure, but a sanctuary created by the person who shares it with you. Elias learned to stop counting his ghosts and to start seeing the grace that stood before him. He learned that the bravest act is not to endure a loss, but to dare to accept a new blessing. Thank you for your time and your attention. It is the greatest currency you possess, and that you choose to spend it here with me is something I value more than words can say. It is you, the listener, who keeps this channel alive, who gives this voice a place to land. I hope life brings you moments of unexpected grace and the courage to accept them when they arrive. Until we meet again in the pages of the next story, be well and be good to one another.